Good morning and hello, everybody. My name is Eric Clay. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Flair, and with me today is Nick Reva. Nick, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself? Although I suspect the job title goes pretty far.
Yes, cyber janitor at Snapchat.
Perfect. Well, today we're going to be discussing operationalizing data from threat intelligence and the cybercrime ecosystem. And Nick here is a fantastic person to talk to. He, first of all, recently wrote a book. I didn't give you a chance to discuss your book in the last webinar, Nick, but I would love to have you take a minute to talk about your book, what it's
Yeah.
about, and what types of problems it helps solve.
Oh my gosh, Eric, thank you so much for the shameless plug here. Yeah, so working at companies like Snap and SpaceX and being in the industry for going on 17 years now, I feel like I've lived a career and I've gained some insights, and it's really time to give back. It's time to share knowledge, not hoard knowledge. It's time to help others understand what the patterns look like, how to think through some of these cases, like some of the largest teams in the industry that I've been involved with. And so myself and a couple of colleagues at Snap, we decided to write a book on what we call securing cloud native apps. The premise of it is basically imagine you're a company that's either younger, that is cloud native, that you don't have a lot of data center footprint, or you're a company that's transforming more to be more of a digital native. What are the patterns and architecture and design philosophies that you need to think about to secure your applications in the cloud? And rather than taking more of a vendor specific approach of here's how you do it in GCP and here's how you do it in AWS and here's how you do it for Okta SaaS and here's how you do it with some other SaaS. Um, Rather, here's the patterns without specific vendor implementation details that are going to bound to change in 3 months. So that's our book. It's coming out later next year. Feel free to take a look. Be happy if you enjoy it, and if you don't, please also let me know.
Awesome. That absolutely is a very pressing issue. I know when I walk through a lot of conference halls and booths, these days there's a huge amount on cloud security, securing cloud native apps. There's a lot of vendors in the space, and it is probably one of the most challenging areas of our time in security. So today we're going to be talking about operationalizing cybercrime data. How do you take data from the cybercrime ecosystem, from threat intelligence platforms, or directly from dark web and Telegram in some cases, if you're an organization that takes a do-it-yourself approach, and then turn that into value for your security team? And then how do you report on that and actually
Mhm.
show that value across the organization? So we're going to be taking it in kind of broad broad strokes here. But first, we're going to talk about types of cybercrime data. And we talked about this a little bit in our last webinar. We talked a lot about info stealing, malware, leak credentials. But Nick, I'd love to start with just an overview of maybe the top three types of cybercrime data you think are really, really critical for a security program today, and then why those are critical. What problems specifically they solve in a security function.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this boils down to data that you use for offensive purposes and data that you may even use for defensive purposes, depending on the style of organization and what you're actually able to implement in sort of defenses. Largely, data about account takeovers that may have happened or are bound to happen, particularly if you're a business to consumer kind of company like Snap, where we have hundreds of millions of daily active users using our platform. Getting exposure to account takeover data from dumps or credential lists that are specifically targeting platforms, such as ours or other platforms, would be very useful. Secondly, data about potentially leaked credentials for employee accounts, corporate enterprise security mapped area, largely what I focus on at Snap. Also very useful because then you can act on that data set and you can do things like reset their passwords, enforce stronger authentication requirements for authentication to corporate systems. That's very, very useful. You can act on it. It could have false positives, but it is also really the only way that you would know that credential is exposed outside of your nominal authentication logs, because you won't necessarily know that those are illegitimate. And I think the third category is a bit kind of like industry specific. There's probably things that companies want to know about uh, cybercrime chatter and discussions that is being done in a way to conspire against them, right? maybe discussions of novel vulnerabilities, maybe discussions of edge infrastructure that's particularly vulnerable, maybe specific campaigns targeting if you're in the critical infrastructure space, if you're in the financial services space. And these take many different kind of shapes and forms, and let's call them modalities. But largely these are industry specific, and they're usually very, very kind of nuanced to what the industry cares about. So for us, this might be, just discussions of uh, affecting infrastructure in a certain way. I'm being
Yeah.
ambiguous intentionally because I can't like overexpose. So that information would have value to us, and we could act on it, right? But if we know it's kind of specific to our world, that is that's the specificity that's really necessary here in order to be able to act on it and operationalize it. Otherwise, it's just chatter, and chatter with the large context that teams deal with, it's just it doesn't go to the top in terms of importance. It remains chatter.
Yeah, I think I can provide a more specific example for you, Nick, that's kind of like company agnostic, but that like we've seen use cases around before where maybe there is a large financial institution that runs its kind of like own payment security processes or anti-fraud processes, and somebody will publish a guide or be like just publish information on like, hey, here's how to bypass like XYZ banks financial fraud and payment verification systems, so you have to order a credit card with like a fake, they'll have like an entire
Mhm.
system for basically like bypassing a certain bank's anti-fraud measures, and like, log in from or use like a VPN located in this region. Like it's that sort of data. And then if you're
Yes.
that bank, it's really useful to understand, okay, threat actors have kind of figured out like this step by step, probably through a lot of trial and error on how to actually bypass our anti-fraud measures. And so we need to adjust that. And so I think it's that kind of like specificity that can provide a lot of value. But I agree, when you look at like cybercrime chatter as a whole, it's like 99.9% noise and 0.001% like really, really high value. You need to know this. And I think that's part of the art of it, is like finding the really tiny sliver that is useful and valuable.
Yeah, yeah, precisely. But I do think it fits into those three categories. Again, just to summarize, there's the business to consumer type of concern of your the users of your platform, the consumers of your product or service, may have their accounts exposed. You should be able to index that and act on that. Then the second one is your workforce, your employees, your enterprise. Very, very important. A single compromise of an employee account with a lot of access can be extremely dire. Um, and then the third one is the industry specific example, as Eric put it.
Yeah, I think Nick, it's interesting to me that you put the consumer accounts number one there, and I'm not sure if you're ordering them in number of priority, but that like I feel that's somewhat unusual, at least from what I've seen, where most companies are thinking employees first,
Yeah.
maybe tactics and techniques second, and maybe users like a far third, but you put them at number one. Do you see this as a trend or something that companies should be looking at in a different way?
Yeah. I ordered them that way because there's only so much defense you can put in for the first cohort. So the business to consumer use case is always going to be a matter of how much friction do we create for the person sign in or sign up experience. If we create too much friction, then they're probably going to abandon the platform. And there's this constant negotiation and discussion with the growth teams at companies that are responsible for customer experience. And this only really applies to kind of like internet scale companies that have a large, footprint of accounts. But this could also apply to companies that even have like, I don't know, vendor procurement portals where you're getting fake vendors being created. The reason I ordered it that way is because this is basically an unsolvable thing. It's impossible to solve all account takeovers for business to consumer use cases at scale. Impossible. There's just too much variety and variance, and the only way to really improve is by having very, very good signals for abusive patterns, being able to do dynamic step-up authentication challenges while the person's authenticating. Like for example, if a person's historically authenticated from certain parts of the world and now they're authenticating from new parts of the world, or they've historically authenticated from four device identifiers and now they're authenticating from a fifth, and you sort of collapse and group these signals together into what's called a risk oracle, and then you can act on that. Even with all that sophistication, this is an impossible to solve space completely. So then what you do is, okay, let's look for the exposure based on either data set dumps of either our credentials, hopefully not, but even like similar credentials. And so like let's say we have Nick at Gmail with the password of butterfly. I'm making it up. Let's say I use that password everywhere, right? If that credential is exposed, the Nick at Gmail password butterfly, and then we can match that cryptographically as a hash to with our own platform account password, then we know, oh, Nick's account is exposed, and we can take some actions. And there's other companies that do this kind of thing, but obviously dark and gray web is where these things get posted, and so you can then ingest them and act on that, right? um, but even with all that, again, this space is not fully solvable. The second one, the enterprise authentication, it is solvable in my opinion with very, very strong controls. So that's the reason I ordered them that way, because the first one I think needs more effort, because in the long run it just can't be fully solved. The second one I think is solvable, and companies like ours have made a lot of progress in effectively eliminating employee account ATO.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting answer, Nick. And I hadn't thought about it like that before, but using kind of leak credentials or info stealer logs or this type of like cybercrime data, not only just like, hey, directly, there's a customer, they're in a stealer log, we need to reset their account, but also using it as a signal, hey, like this customer showed up in a combo list or like showed up in a credential leak. And, we're also seeing this other unusual activity in our internal systems, and kind of combining that data, using it as a signal to escalate and say, okay, this user is highly likely to be compromised, as opposed to maybe, a lower likelihood. I can see how that's a huge amount of value there.
Yeah, or there's even other things you can do. Like you can combine these signals. Even if you allow them to authenticate, you scope their authentication token differently to different API endpoints within your product to only allow them to do certain things. You sort of like sandbox them into certain
Sandbox them a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And so, or you may do what we call internally like a cooldown, to basically prevent them from changing critical parts of the app profile details. Like you cannot change the display name, you cannot change the email, you cannot change the phone number, you cannot change the two-factor settings, for example, because those are techniques that people use to squat accounts. So if we cool them down, let's say for the first like 3 days, then the battery's like, oh my gosh, this is like, I'm getting impatient, I can't make these changes. But they don't really know like what's happening, right? It's just like it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. So you do this sort of transparently, but that's another very powerful technique. And
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Now, I want to move the discussion, I suppose, like up one level of abstraction. So we're talking about credential data, we're talking about stealer log data, we're talking about chatter, but then there's kind of like sources, right? We have to get this information from somewhere. And so you can kind of categorize the main ones as like dark web forums, dark web markets, Telegram, and other chat applications. Like it's not just Telegram anymore. There's like Signals in there, Session, Matrix, Talks. And then there's kind of like clear web sources. Like there's some of these like gray web hacking forums that are available on the clear web, but absolutely are facilitating cybercrime. And then maybe ransom blogs is like a fifth. How would you think, Nick? So I don't want to like sell Flare here. That's not the goal. But like Flare is obviously a platform that kind of grabs all of these. But if you were to take a do-it-yourself approach, like you were going to build everything internally for a company for whatever reason, how would you think about prioritizing those sources, and how would you think about like taking that, like structuring that data to make it actionable for a security program?
it's extremely hard. Well, let's just start with that. This is a very, very difficult thing to DIY, do it yourself.
Yeah.
The way I would structure it is contextual to where the pain is. Where is the most pain for your company? Is the most pain with B2C consumer account takeovers? And are you getting a lot of negative publicity around that? Are people talking about your platform becoming less trusted? That could very well be the case. That there could be a lot of pain. Either it's external pain, through optics and kind of publicity, or actual internal pain because the people being targeted are high-profile people on platform. Now, if the pain is in the enterprise corporate space, that pain will only really be known internally. It very seldom will be known externally, unless it leads to some kind of incident that is then publicly shared or shareable, but based on incident disclosure laws that the companies have to follow. So ask yourself the question, where is the pain? Okay, let's say you've established the pain is here. Then prioritize the sources that are most likely to enable pain reduction. This is like going to the doctor. The doctor says, "What hurts, Eric?" And Eric says, "My elbow hurts." Okay, we're going to look at your ligaments. We're going to do a CT scan of that part of the arm to determine where the problem potentially lies. We're going to do diagnostics. It's just kind of similar thing here. We have to as security leaders go after where the pain is. We cannot go after everything, just impossible. There's too much things to do. There's not enough time in the day. You're never going to have enough people, even in well-resourced companies like Snapchat. You have to pursue the pain. And so let's say you pursue the pain and you figure out, okay, the pain is here and the sources of this information are 1, 2, and 3. Then you have to build some kind of crawler and indexer that indexes this information for you. And you have to do it in a way where you don't get caught by those that are running the platform, so they don't infer that you're actually doing this for those reasons. Like, because obviously they know that there's organizations that do this from a threat intelligence perspective. Even Flare needs to cautiously kind of navigate this area, and I'm sure you guys can't like really talk
There's
about how you do
quite a
that.
bit of complexity in it, actually. Yeah, it depends on the source. Some sources like Telegram are very easy. They don't make it particularly difficult. There's not really, but other sources like especially like dark web forums and markets will very much have like anti-crawling mechanisms in place, and so you have to build systems that can get around those and kind of like fool them, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like even when we study some of these, there's capture providers. There's all kinds of different things you have to overcome. So, let's say you're able to do all that. Now, you need to store this somewhere, whether it's a structured storage or unstructured storage. Then you have to mine this data, have a data science minded person actually look for signals in the very large haystack that are important and relevant. And then you have to constantly keep it updated, right? Backfill it basically based on most recent scans and crawls. And then at some point, you're probably going to get rate limited. The pipelines that you're using for this are probably going to break, and you're going to have to go spend a bunch of effort figuring out, or they may even cut you off because they figure out your user agent and your exact pattern that you use, and you have to kind of retool and try to bypass and anti-crawling mechanisms. It's a lot of work. It's very, very hard. I don't know if it's worth it for I don't know 99.9% of companies to do on their own, which is why platforms such as yours I think are very valuable in the industry.
Yeah, so Nick, like going off of that, so let's say you get your data, whether you do it yourself, which I probably not super recommended, or you buy a platform like Flare or a different one. There's other platforms that do something vaguely similar, and then you're wanting to import this data into your own security program. So you want to
Yeah,
take it into a SIM or a SOAR, or even like a ticketing system. How would you how would you think about like normalizing? And we'll talk about like specific data elements because ransom files is a little bit different to normalize than like a stealing
yeah,
log. But we can start with like traditional credentials and then kind of go down the list. How would you think
sure.
about like taking traditional credentials for both corporate and consumer accounts and then turning
Yeah,
those into security action? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth
yeah,
going into granular detail
yeah.
here.
Let's go a little bit deeper. So the adage of let's put it into the sim and have the SOC folks deal with it. Not the case here. This is too specific. So what we really need to do, in my opinion, is you need to first of all filter through the noise and figure out what is consequential and what isn't consequential. And that's actually very difficult to do because that is it consequential aspect isn't attached to the data empirically. You have to attach other data attributes or other intelligence to determine that. So, for example, uh, let's say it's a bunch of what appears to be leaked credentials for corporate data for company X. Those credentials may be completely wrong. Those credentials might be completely not relevant. Those credentials might be red herrings that somebody's trying to do to kind of distract you. Those credentials might be from incidents that have already passed that you've already addressed. So you if you were to ingest that data feed into your sim and all of a sudden start firing alerts for your folks to go investigate, they're really going to hate this because it's going to they're going to start chasing these apparent
False
incidents,
positives. Yeah.
but they're actually false positives, right? So what you really need to do is you need to create a filtering and a normalization layer, and there's different techniques on how to do this. But some of the techniques that I've seen work is you basically apply kind of business context to the data based on what those, let's say the state of the account is. Like, is the account in a separated state? Let's say it's a corp account. You can check to see if that account is in a separated state. If that account is in a separated state belonging to a former employee, why are we going to go chase resetting or doing something with that account if that account's in a lock state? So you can actually engineer checks to check for account state and a sort of like consequence. If it's locked in and unused belonging to a former employee, okay, it's not great that it's out there, and we can figure out maybe how it got there, but it's not necessarily consequential in the here and now, right? So then that's not even hard to do. Like, you can use platforms like Tines, which is a security automation orchestration platform, to do calls to your workplace IDP, identity provider, and check on that account. You literally parse for that string, account at company.com, and check for the status of account, whether that's in your Okta, whether that's in your AD, whether that's in something else that you use for identity. Okay, so then you determine, okay, is it in a state that's useful or not? Let's say it is. Then what I would do is you would cut a ticket to your whoever is in your security operations area. It could be a SOC, it could be a detection response team, and then they research and determine what to do with it. Right? Is it something that needs to be rotated? Is it something that needs to be uh, that you need to call a security incident because there's potentially been a leakage, right? That's how, like, just a kind of a simple example, but that's the level of precision that I think we need in order to act on this, not overwhelm your teams. Because if you don't take this approach and you literally start firing alerts, your teams are going to hate this. They're going to send them into a chase, and that chase is not going to end in any career satisfaction. It's probably going to lead to turnover.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. We also have multiple questions, Nick. So I'm going to prioritize the audience questions, but I do have one comment there, which so I've seen some companies do this really, really well, where they'll even, for example, with info stealer malware, if they have a lot of infections happening for whatever reason, there's a lot of kind of corporate employees, or maybe they have contractors, so it's not like all employees, but so I've actually seen companies even prioritize the info stealer logs based on like the URLs that the logs have access to. Like, these are kind of tier one because these are things we really care about, and these are tier two or three. They're contractor portals that there's not really any sensitive information in. So we're as we have this very limited bandwidth, we'll prioritize the ones that we think have the highest risk of gaining unauthorized access to something super critical. So we have two questions here, and I think the first one you've touched on a lot, but I'll go ahead and ask it in case there's something you want to add to it in the context of this specific question. How often do you investigate these authentication incidents, especially at scale? And is there some type of automation or algorithm that negates false positives?
Yeah, I talked about this a bit around the applying the context of current state to that signal before you actually process it. So I call it kind of pre-processing of the signal before the signal is then determined to be a true or false positive. So talked about that a little bit. There's other techniques that you could apply. You could look at historical IPs that people have authenticated from. People probably authenticate from the same places most of the time, unless they're traveling, right? Or there's some kind of other anomaly. You could look at user agent that they've used historically and compare it with the user agent that you're seeing, currently. Those are just a couple of examples, but like ultimately the goal is to be intentional with what you ask the people to actually investigate, rather than just kind of over the wall and then hope they deal with it. It's better to, I think, honestly, like over the long run, it's better to not fire a signal that you're kind of reasonably confident is false positive, and to fire a signal, have a person research, and then have them spend a bunch of time on this, and then like through the course of weeks and days, they just get frustrated with their job and it leads to turnover.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Nick. I would add too, on like the data provider side too, is I think data providers like that are providing these types of data have a role to play here as well, especially around false positives, right? Because you'll see in some cases criminals will create like fake info stealer logs or fake sets of credentials, and then distribute them trying to gain reputation. Because this is one of the primary ways rep is built in the ecosystem, is like sharing combo lists and credentials and stuff.
Yeah.
And so providers, so I can give you an example, is like one of the trends we've noticed is somebody, we don't know who, some entity injected hundreds of thousands of fake Stealer logs into the ecosystem. And so they look real. They have, Fortune 50 companies, just like, credential. But if like they're absolutely 100% faked, probably AI generated. And so we actually built kind of like detection rules on our side, our collection side, so that when we collect these, we bring them install, but then we score them informational and we don't alert on them. So if somebody wants to search through them for some reason, they can, but we're also trying not to provide those for customers. So I think you can do kind of a defense in depth approach here. One of the other things we've experimented with and are working on is applying like classifier machine learning models to cybercrime chatter to say like, because you want to filter through the 99% of chatter that's irrelevant and get to the 1% that actually has like meaning for customers. I don't know
Yeah.
if there's something you'd want to add there,
Yeah.
Nick.
No, those are all really good points. Other thing I've done is look at prevalence and look at sort of frequency and look at coverage across different sources. So if it's sometimes if it's covered across multiple sources, they might just be resharing the same combo list or the same steal logs, trying to get reputation to kind of Eric's point. So that could be like a sign of them kind of gaming it a bit, and it's actually not, probably not a truly actionable data set. But again, like applying the business context, like just back to square zero again, I'll just repeat it. Literally checking on the state of the account and checking on the state of other authentication events for that person. You can fully automate this right now in the modern day. Like it's not very hard to do. Even if you're not like a software engineering kind of company, you can use things like Tines and other platforms. Just doing that will remove a lot of this because a lot of it's not true positive.
Yeah, I think that's another great point, Nick. I actually saw a single credential. So the way we organize credentials in our data set is we have like we'll say named breach, and so it could be like 2012 LinkedIn breach, right? And then there'll be combo lists where threat actors are resharing the same credential set or a credential set with the same URL but maybe different passwords. And I've seen up to 20, 30 reshares on the same credential set from 12 years ago, where it just continually gets reshared. So I think that's a fantastic point. We have a second question, which is
Mhm.
how often do you have your SOC keep alerting on harvested creds with current employer? They keep getting failed login attempt from password sprays.
Uh, Nick, great name, great question. Uh, yeah, the way we've designed our authentication requirements, we don't really have this problem because we have strong second factor required. So it doesn't get to the stage of a failed attempt because they're not able to provide the second factor um, at all in almost all cases, right? So we don't actually deal with this ourselves, but I imagine if we would, a lot of the same techniques that we talked about just recently would apply to this. Is you you basically need a way to filter on what is a true and false positive from these password spraying attacks. So if it's like a spray and pray attempt, which is probably what's happening here, Nick, I'm guessing, then only a small subset of those is going to match, and then so your ability to actually harvest similar data yourself and look for matches yourself, whether they're like leaked or like true spray and praise, will I think help kind of filter through this to make it less consequential, less of a distraction to your teams. Um, but really, like I'd rather suggest that you put your efforts into improving your authentication requirements to a strong second factor, so they can't truly spray and pray. Like that's harder to do, but that has like a much more durable outcome, and it's a very very strong control. And we've talked about this publicly in other forums, but since we've done the FIDO2 and our passkeys, along with shorter sessions and the normal username and password, we've literally had no account takeovers in a corp for many years.
Awesome. Well, thank you for these were two fantastic questions. You can tell we have a high quality audience today because the questions are really good.
Yeah, these
Um,
are these are harder, but great questions, Nick.
ask Nick all of your hard questions. Um, so it looks like hey Nick, Arian Gunther wanted me to tell you hello.
Oh, hey
Um,
Karthik, I know Arian. He's a cool guy. Thanks for joining the webinar.
yeah, thank you for joining. So Nick, I have another another hard question for you, and this is kind of a data element that's much harder in some ways to prioritize. Since we're in the habit of asking Nick really hard questions, and I don't ever tell anybody what questions I'm going to ask them, so I'm truly putting them on the spot here.
This is truly
But
unscripted, folks. You know,
yeah,
we are prepared, but we're not scripted.
exactly. So info stealer logs, I feel like are easier to parse in some ways because you can do rules. You can say if there's these URLs in them, they're high priority. If they're, if they're structured in this way, we're more concerned about them, or we can differentiate. We can put them in the consumer stream versus the corporate stream, but ransom files are not. And so this is a really interesting area, I think. Is ransomware groups are increasingly just stealing files and posting them on the dark web rather than encrypting. In a lot of cases, we don't even see ransomware groups bothering to encrypt stuff anymore. They'll just steal the files. They'll say, pay us $10 million, or we're going to file. We're going to publish all of these on our blog in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And third party, this creates a huge issue for basically every company because imagine your law firm, your accounting firm, your IT service provider gets compromised by ransomware, and all of their files that include a bunch of your files, legal agreements, etc., get stolen. And they may not alert you; they're legally required to, but that doesn't mean that everybody follows the law to the T, especially when they're dealing with a crisis. And so, like Nick, I'm really curious as to your thoughts on how you take a data source like that. So you have a third party that, let's say, an accounting firm ends up on a ransomware blog. It has a bunch of
Mhm.
your financial statements. Let's say you're not a publicly traded company, so a lot of this is non-public information.
Mhm.
How would you effectively look to go through, identify that in the first place, and then prioritize that in an effective way?
Yeah, so let me just play it back to you. So you're a law firm or a financial services company that has customer data. That customer data ends up in a ransomware forum where it's either advertised for leakage in exchange for cryptocurrency to prevent leakage, or it's encrypted and then there's some other consequence that they're alluding to. Is that right, Eric?
Well, in my example, it's your third party. So you're over here. You haven't been hit with ransomware, but your third party has been hit with ransomware, and
Yes, yes,
all of
yes, yes,
their
yes.
files have been stolen. So how do you figure out how do you
Yes,
prioritize
yes,
and
yes, yes.
effectively get the intel from that?
Yes, the classic third-party risk management, another thing that's like largely fully not fully solvable, even after many, many years. Um,
I'm going to ask you about P versus NP next.
yes, yes, yes. Great, great, great questions today. Uh, I think the way you would approach this is as follows. So you you should really understand who are your most critical vendors from a third-party risk management perspective. And I know everybody says that, but like really try to understand it based on whatever assessment process you have and try to hyper prioritize that smaller set of vendors that has the most consequential data. Uh, Not every vendor has the most consequential data. Like be really intentional about asking yourself, what is our data classification? Who are the vendors that have the most consequential data? So let's say you do that. Then look, I truly think there's only two ways to manage this. Uh, the first one would be you set expectations contractually with that vendor who holds that data to monitor for such activity on a MSA level as part of a security addendum. I know, folks, this is the lawyer answer, but you need to have at least an attempt to do that because then you put the onus on them to do it for them, to do it for themselves, right? To protect their customers and to protect their product, whatever it is. Obviously, your mileage may vary depending on their sophistication ability to do that, but I would write that into the contracts. We've started actually doing things like this. Secondly, if it's truly a very, very important vendor, I would invest in a monitoring capability for this yourself, like as your own company. For your most critical vendors, look for examples in cases of leakage for their product in the context of your company. And that's super hard to do because it might say like company name X, and it may not have your company's usage of X defined. But there are obviously ways to kind of infer that through now large language models and more ML based techniques if you're truly concerned. But I would say like that second list needs to be like a very short list. It needs to be very methodically defined. Like why are we spending the time on this? Where this is really like a third party responsibility, which is why I say okay, put it into the MSA, put it into the contract. try to get them to do it. But if you're still worried about their ability to do it, or the vendor's like truly critical to you, then do it yourself, and have this open line of communication with their security team where you could notify them of things that you see. Um, through a like a trusted exchange kind of model, almost like an ISAC kind of model.
Yeah, no, I think that that is an excellent answer. That is as close as you can get to a solution for a very difficult to solve problem. It's all about kind of like risk tolerance and mitigate, like what level of risk mitigation you're able to get to. We do have another question, Nick, and I think this is a really interesting one. So the question is, I guess this is more of a Flare question, but even with Nick, how do you handle this information, especially the full info sealer logs that have content that is illegal, like abuse material or fraud? Now, I can take a quick stab at this and just say I have never encountered a dealer log with abuse material, and I've gone through a fair number of them with prospects and customers just because that's not typically what is going on. Like, that's not how Steelers are distributed. So there's not a lot of this or any of this that I've seen in. Now,
Yeah.
fraud is another interesting one because we have seen criminals get infected with info stealer malware. But Nick, I'm gonna hand this one over to you. How do you? I think there's a whole bunch of interesting scenarios you could run through here. Like, you find out an employee is committing fraud through an info stealer log that has corporate credentials, right? Like, how do you manage that? There's a lot of complexity
Uh,
here.
yes, haven't had this exact experience. Really good question, Gavin. I'm going to give you the legal answer here. I think you need to involve your legal and compliance team and assess the circumstances of what's being presented, and decide based on your corporate policies what further investigation does it warrant. Um, you want to be very cautious with how you present the facts, and caveat to lawyers and less technical people that these steel logs may not be true. A lot
That's
of
a
this could be
really excellent
fabricated.
point.
This could be like a distractive measure to uh, redirect your attention while they do something else, possibly like from like a offensive point of view. Um, yeah, I haven't dealt with this case like this, truthfully, and I would say before you like panic and call an incident, like really be certain there's other data attributes that kind of lead to, okay, there's something here, versus it purely acting on the info stealer like existence. I think you need like secondary signals to validate a case
Yeah.
like.
Nick, I think that's a really fantastic point. It is like really worth emphasizing how easy it would be to fake data in a Steeler log. So you could take a log that has, say, Corporation X, not the social media platform. We're just using X as a random example here, like corporate credentials to a Corporation X, and then somebody goes and adds in, say, like child abuse websites or like credentials to child abuse websites to that Steeler log, right? And so you have a legitimate Steeler log with legitimate corporate credentials, but then somebody has added in something that is not legitimate, but there's no way to say for certain, okay, well, the corporate credentials are legitimate, so that means these other credentials in here are legitimate as well. Just because it's in the end, these are like zip files with txt, like they're text files. Somebody can edit text files, zip them up, and then redistribute them in the ecosystem, and there's not a way to really definitively say how it was edited or changed.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be surprised what people do to either try to publicly shame you or affect your credibility. It's wild. So don't be cautious with how you respond to these things, because you can get excited. Even very senior people can get excited about things like this and like, oh my god, look at what it is. We have to go chase it, and that chase could be a deep rabbit hole that you burn a lot of time on.
So for our next topic, Nick, I would like to wait. Actually, we have another question, which I love it. The more questions, the better. What is a good risk reduction and hardening strategy around Active Directory?
Ooh, this is probably for a different webinar to give a full answer. Uh, I'm gonna give you the answer you probably don't want to hear is, try to reduce your dependence on it. Is my kind of take on Active Directory. Obviously, a lot of companies can't because it's so deeply rooted into their ecosystem. Um, I would say whatever. I don't know the Microsoft ecosystem that well, the kind of companies I worked with are not Microsoft mapped generally. But I would say whatever authentication requirements Microsoft provides that allow for shorter sessions, faster cookie rotations, less non TPM credential binding. If you can bind credentials to TPM, trusted platform modules, if you can reduce the session duration, reducing long-lived sessions is a very, very effective control to reduce risk of ATO of corporate accounts. Yes, people are going to complain, but at our company, people have to log in every single day, and their session is valid for 20 hours, 20. But that's a very effective technique to reduce account takeover. Even if they get it, it's only valid for an absolute maximum of 20 hours, right? So I know that may not be practical in some environments that are just not as geared towards this kind of thing, but the reality is we're fighting cybercrime, and we are the only teams in the industries that actually have adversaries. A lot of other engineering teams show up and create features, but we are fighting adversaries. So sometimes we have to make very hard principled decisions to affect user authentication to protect the company. And those are some of the things I've done, and your mileage may vary depending on where you work. But I feel strongly that the engineering approach is probably the better approach and it's more scalable here.
Awesome. Let's see. The next thing we want to go to is prioritization. We're not going to take too long on prioritization because we've already made it through 41 minutes, Nick. So we're running out of time. And then I
All
want to
right.
talk about kind of levels of threat intelligence and like operational, tactical, technical, strategic, not in that order. I just completely misordered them. But let's start with, so we've talked about like managing large volumes, prioritizing effectively. One of the things when we had that kind of preview up in our discussion, you talked about is the importance of having what you called a high judgment. And I actually notated this because I thought it was an interesting point. A high judgment person lead the response. So let's say you have something that you do deem critical for whatever reason. It's
Yes.
a new tactic against your platform. It's a senior corporate executive who's been involved in info stealer malware. What do you see? Like, how do you? We've operationalized the data. Now, how do you respond to that in an effective way that maximizes the risk reduction
Yeah.
for your company and like takes in these facts that there's a lot of nuance. It's not always black and white or very
Yes.
clear.
I do think the high judgment person operating the incident is a requirement. You cannot assign this to lower skill level folks because they're going to make judgment calls that are not appropriate. In most cases, is what I've seen, and I mean it could affect your team's credibility. It could affect the whole sentiment of the situation. So if you don't have such a resource, then you may need to seek help from a third party to help with the investigative parts. I would say start to validate the consequence or the potential consequence immediately. Look at authentication logs. Has this credential been used in any case? Look at differences in IP address or user agent. Look at what applications the person has historically interacted with. It's a deep dive. It's a technical investigation. It's not going to be simple. It's going to require truth seeking, right? Of what was potentially done, and only then can you really arrive at a determination of what do we do next. Now, don't sit on this for days upon a time. If you see quickly that there appears to be exfiltration, or there appears to be data theft, or there appears to be true abuse, act on it and remediate the matter. Uh, but if very senior people are involved, there needs to be very tight communication explaining okay, look, there's been a suspected incident. This is what we're doing right now. We maybe you make the judgment call early to rotate the account credentials. I think it just all depends on sort of circumstance. I think what you can't do is you can't start chasing these whimsically and resetting credentials left and right, because then some of those are going to be wrong. And over time, if your team starts doing that, you're going to burn your team's credibility, and which is going to burn your own credibility, assuming you're a leader or a manager of that team.
So one of the things you mentioned there is like the difference between serious threats versus hobbyist threats, or maybe not hobbyist is the right word, but serious threats versus kind of like junk. What are some ways you might go through and determine that something, and I'll hone in on like a specific example. So you have an employee who shows up on a combo list or
Mhm.
a new named breach with like leaked credentials, but it's like a less verified breach. It's not in the news. You know, it's not like one of these major breaches where you're like, okay, I'm very sure these are the right credentials. Like, how would you go about kind of investigating that if in this case?
Yeah. Um, usually the hobbyist folks who do this, they don't have such good OPSEC, operational security, so they may reuse their handles across different platforms. I would say seeking truth on the credibility of the source is extremely hard. It's also very hard to like really draw causality to who actually done it. It's one of the things we get asked a lot is like, tell me who did it. Like, well, attribution is a very hard thing, right?
XX
So
Hunter XX on the Dread Dark Web, or exploit
yeah,
I Dark Web forum.
but looking at whatever handle is associated with that post and seeing like, okay, does this person appear to have credibility in industry? Chat discussing it amongst peers that you may have in the industry. We have um, this is privileged, of course, but we have a relationship with Google's Tag Threat Advisory Group, where we can collaborate with them on things like this. Like, where else have you seen this actor? If you have a relationship with, let's say, Mandiant or some of the other security threat research groups, you can inquire and say, hey, tell me about what do you know about this threat actor. Um, I mean, even Flare's platform, I think, can give you some of that kind of insights. But what I'm inferring here is like a little more of what we call like the finished threat intelligence or the complete threat intelligence, where you put in an inquiry and then outcomes of like an analysis over a period of time. Um, it's really hard. Like it's there's no like simple way to do this, and I think as you can see, like one of my kind of principles for this is like do it selectively. Do it where there's a higher likelihood of consequence. Because if you don't, you're really gonna burn your team. And at first it's gonna be exciting, but when it leads to either nothing or kind of false positives, you're both burning your team and your political capital.
And speaking of that, I think our last, so we're going to try to get through two last topics, maybe three, but we're very short on time now. So I'll go ahead and jump right in. So one of the other things we discussed, Nick, is like segmenting intelligence across different layers, right? So we've talked a lot about like how do we operationalize data, but how do we also segment it, right? You could have technical threat intel data like IOCs, for example. These are malicious IPs and domains being used to
Mhm.
distribute malware. You could have operational threat intelligence data, leak credentials, dealer logs. You could have tactical threat intel data. What are the latest ransomware groups doing? And then you can have like very strategic levels of information. Do you think that's a fair way to segment it? And how
Yeah.
would you look at like effectively using that taxonomy to kind of enable a
Yes.
team?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm gonna try to answer this kind of quickly, but so the way I look at it is there's threat intelligence that a detection and response or a threat intelligence team needs to take action on a matter. Like let's say like a narrower matter usually is what it is, where there's a likelihood of a info stealer being exposed and the likelihood of a one or more persons corporate credentials being affected as a result of this. Right. That's kind of narrow. They can work it at kind of at their level, but then over time, if these patterns they surface into like larger occurrences or more frequent occurrences, then this becomes more of a foundational gap in your security posture. You have to ask yourself the question is, well, how is this happening? Right. Well, it's happening because we have potentially ineffective antivirus and EDR controls that are allowing the info stealers to be installed in the machines and to collect the credentials, or we're allowing people to authenticate from non-company machines to our corporate systems. So then you have to ask yourself the question of, well, what hardening controls do we need to put in place, either to make our endpoint security more effective or to make it impossible to access corporate systems using non-company machines? Then that leads you to a completely different set of conversations and usually a different team at the company that's responsible for hardening of this experience versus the narrower kind of incident response, handling the cases, right? And they feed one another, right? So if you see patterns of, okay, InfoStealer ran on I'm just gonna make it up, like people a quarter were infected, right? And you look at it and see, well, yeah, I mean these five people have really high quality endpoint detection and response software on their corporate machines. How did it happen? We start digging and you find the user agents and you see like, wait a second, they're using a Mac. Why is this like a Windows VM? And the user agent's different. It looks like it's coming from a different place. Like, oh, it was from a non-corporate machine, right? So then you ask yourself the question, okay, well, how do we disallow non-corporate machine usage? That's your zero trust beyond core, VPN strategy, whatever it is, right? But that's a different way of solving it. And you're never going to fully solve this risk if you allow people to use not non-corporate managed machines, period. Because people can log in from their own, and their own machine is like consumer grade everything, right? Like it's not hardened to your company state.
That was a really nice answer, Nick. I think you flowed through the operational to, or technical to strategic really, really nicely there.
Thank you.
Um, Yeah, and I think like one of the other questions I would have for you is like I think this is a really, really hard challenge is like communicating the data up to like an executive and board level, right? Because your executives and your boards are on average not information security specialists. And
Yeah.
so, and you come off, at least I come off probably as a bit of a crazy person when I'm trying to communicate to like there's this malware and it steals everything on your computer and then it exfiltrates it. Then it goes into Telegram and then the Telegram threat actors sell it. You come off as a little like, so how do you communicate the kind of right level of information up in a
Yeah.
way that enables like good context aware decision making, but without like drowning somebody in technical details of how all of this works?
I think you lead with consequence and pain creation. I'll make it up on the spot. I'm gonna try to be good here. Dear Mr. or Mrs. Executive, as a result of info-stealer logs and our inability to monitor them effectively, we've had X amount of account takeovers in this quarter. That has led to this consequence. We would like to stop this consequence from happening. As a result of this, we need to do these preventative things to harden the enterprise from this happening, and we need to do these detective things to look for it when they slip through. Here's my funding request. Here's my 1.5 headcount that I need for this. Please consider this and let's have a meeting about it. That's literally how I approach these topics.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. Do you find often that you get asked for like a whole bunch of additional technical detail, or is that usually just
I mean, look, like when you establish credibility with people and you work at a company for a while and you're known to not bring things that aren't well formed, then the answer is no, generally no. But if you're not doing it that way, or maybe you may get challenged, you should always have appendices in these kind of documents describing like more technical details. Always have them in your back pocket. Never give an exec a huge document. They're not going to read it. They don't have the time or attention span for it. 3 to 4 pages, absolute max, with appendices describing the specifics if they ask for it. Because then you have it. You don't have to say, "Oh, let me come back to you," right? Like sometimes you need to come back, but try to anticipate that and have it in your back pocket, and then you can solve it in that conversation. That 30-minute slice they've given you in their 16 meetings a day calendar. Take it. Like don't lose that opportunity.
so the last area we have to talk about today, Nick, is evaluating how effective your kind of cybercrime monitoring posture is. And I think this is one of the most interesting questions because I'm a big believer in Goddard's law. I don't know if you're familiar with Goddard's
Yeah.
law. Yeah.
Yes.
When the metric becomes the measure, it ceases to be a useful metric. Basically, if you start measuring people on things that aren't kind of directly, if you like split it into like terminal goals and instrumental goals, like instrumental goals to arrive at like what you really want, and you set all of your metrics around instrumental goals, well, people will tend to like deviate off and try to meet metrics that don't actually have like good outcomes for what you're trying to do in the end. Especially if you base their compensation on it. That's the worst possible way to do it. So Nick, how do you effectively measure let's say a threat intelligence team just for something like more broad, but also like how do you effectively set KPIs that actually make sense and make something measurable but don't create
Yeah.
really perverse incentives?
Threat intel itself as a discipline is extremely hard to measure in isolation. I think the way of measuring it is what you're alluding to is you need metrics on risk reduction, right? And you need to base that off of what is the thing that's at stake that you're worried about, right? So if we're worried about fake Okta authentication portal site creation, right? The Octopus folks have done this and continue to do it. We need for a way to monitor for that existence popping up. and then we need a way to respond to it, right? the the measurement is the risk reduction and the security outcome. You can't just say, "Oh, threat intel team did 5 reports this quarter on threat actor octopus, scatter spider, hummingbird, and something else." The last one I made up for fun, right? You you cannot measure it that way. That's not a good way of measuring it. You have to measure, okay, what actionable steps did the company take based on these 5 reports? And what risk reduction have we had or haven't had, right? Because maybe we're not doing enough. And maybe this is an opportunity to say, you know what? I have 2 threat intelligence engineers. I need a third one because we're not capturing these well enough, right? Threat intelligence is only as useful as the action that you take to act on it. Like it's truly not that useful if you just sit on it. And I think a lot of companies don't really get this right because it's extremely hard and you have to have a lot of maturity and discipline. But that's how I would measure it.
I think that that's a great answer, and I think it really speaks, Nick, to how important different security functions build on each other. Like you can't just have kind of a very basic, governance, risk, and compliance practice even then, and then like hire like a super advanced threat intel team, because if you don't have your risks really, really clearly defined, what are the main things we care about from like an operational perspective, from a governance, risk, and compliance perspective, it's really hard to put the threat intel team to good work to mitigate those risks and to measure how well the threat intel team is doing without the kind of like really, really tight scoped KPIs.
Yeah, like exactly. It's if it's like one of those like reports over the wall, please read it. That's not effective. There needs to be buy-in from whoever's responsible for that, the hardening team and the research threat intel team to feed information, and then for that information to be acted on, and then for that information to be followed through on, or not if it's not useful. But you have to determine that usefulness in a collective sense, not in isolation. Because the TI guys are always going to say, "Oh, it's exciting," like because they're kind of calibrated that way. But when you apply like the larger context, it may not actually be that exciting or that useful.
That absolutely makes sense. Well, I think our last question is one you're totally not expecting, but it's from one of my favorite podcasts does this. So I'm gonna do it to you. What is one book you would recommend our audience that like really informed your life? And it could be anything. It doesn't have to be security, but it
Mm.
certainly can be security. And it can't be your book either. I'll add that
Oh,
one other stipulation.
well, my book was informed by many other books that I realize are not that good. So I realized there's an opportunity here to maybe create something better. But I'll let the audience decide that when the book comes out. Um, look, I'm gonna open up for a minute. I'm an immigrant kid who came to the U.S. when I was 5 from former Soviet Union and made a life in this industry. And early on in my career, around like 15, I decided I was going to go into cybersecurity, and I've been doing this for 20 plus years now. Uh, I read a book by Robert Hercikovic called The Will to Win. Robert Hercikovic, family was born is from Croatia. He was an immigrant to Canada, and his dad, when he landed in Canada, was a janitor. And Robert Hercikovic, as you probably all know, is the guy behind Shark Tank. He has multiple security companies, including Sidera and Hercikovic Group and other. And he's a very accomplished person. So um, his book really talks about what's the characteristic kind of differences that lead people to either win or not. And ultimately, that's one of the things I realized is you have to be persistent and you have to be intentional. And then I think with that, you are likely to have a good outcome for your company and for yourself.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to our audience. We really, really appreciate it. That was a fantastic. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm absolute fantastic recommendation. I'm excited too. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody coming today. Thank you so much. Many people have already added me on LinkedIn. If you haven't, feel free to, and feel free to add Nick as well. Yeah, thank you so much for joining. We'll have another webinar probably next week or the week after.
My pleasure. Thank you, folks, for having me. Bye.